Hello. This is a second video in a series about the astrology of Minneapolis. Please follow along and also please drop me a note or leave a comment with your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. When I look at Minneapolis astrologically, I see a place deeply shaped by questions of land, belonging, justice, and memory. A city whose foundation rests on agreements that were never honored equally, and when imbalance exists at the root, it echoes forward. I'm choosing to hold that sacred throughout this entire series. When I talk about the birth chart of Minneapolis, I'm not actually working from the later incorporation of Minneapolis as a city. I'm actually working from St. Anthony, which was the first town named here in 1847 on the east bank of the Mississippi River. Minneapolis didn't come into being until almost a decade later, in 1856, when St. Anthony and the West Bank settlement were merged and renamed. That's the moment the land was formed, claimed, organized, and brought under U.S. legal and civic authority. So that original imprint of St. Anthony is where I'm choosing to focus. And so when I'm talking about the soul of this place, that's the chart I'm listening to. That's the chart I've studied. That's the chart I'm going to be referring to in this presentation. And so those of you that didn't see part one, and just as a reminder, please go back and watch it. It'll help bring you up to speed as to why I'm doing this and give you a little bit more context. But as an astrologer, the way I use astrology is very simple. I look at patterns. I look at what repeats in cycles. And I'm definitely not going to see everything. So if you also study astrology, I would love to hear your own perspectives on this. There is always more to add to the findings. So I'm going to actually share the chart of St. Anthony so that while I'm sharing some insights, we can both look at the same picture at the same time. So there are a few themes that are unmistakable just looking at the chart. This is a place whose foundational imprint is deeply tied to land belonging and emotional inheritance. There is a strong signature of who gets to belong here, who is protected, and who is not. That alone tells us that we're not dealing with a neutral origin story. St. Anthony was founded through treaties and legal mechanisms that were framed as orderly and legitimate, even as they were extracting land and displacing people. And I'm not going to rehash the events of 1862. This isn't a history lesson, and I've already spoken about much of that in part one. What I'm referring to in an astrological perspective is rotates around the foundational agreements that shaped this place that were never honored equally. And astrology is very clear about this. When imbalance exists at the beginning, it doesn't just fade. With time, it becomes cyclical, especially if it's not healed and dealt with. And one of the strongest patterns in this chart I saw and found is around authority asserting itself through law and the tension that creates when law is disconnected from consent or relationship. Another theme I see very clearly is that the city becomes a stage for a collective reckoning. Things don't stay hidden here. What is buried eventually becomes visible. That's why Minneapolis keeps finding itself at the center of national conversations. It's not because the city is uniquely chaotic, it's because its imprint makes it a place where unresolved dynamics surface. So, which brings me to the present moment. Right now, Minneapolis is experiencing an intense federal presence, including large-scale federal agent operation that we are experiencing as an occupation. Federal authority asserting itself through enforcement, surveillance, and force, once again under the so-called banner of law. From an astrological perspective, that's not a new story here. It's the same pattern expressing itself in new form. External power entering this place, asserting control and force towards marginalized communities through legal structures, creating fear, disruption, and terror in the process. So I believe it's carrying a long unresolved pattern and one that keeps asking the same question in different ways. Who has actual authority here? Who belongs here? And at what cost? Those are the questions I'm holding as we explore. So what you're looking at on the screen right now is the birth chart for St. Anthony Township, right inside the time of heightened tensions and broken treaties with the Dakota that eventually escalated into the 1862 war. When I look at this chart, the first thing that jumps out at me is the sun in the sign of Cancer, which sits right here. And so Cancer is land. It's home, belonging, it's ancestry, who gets to feel safe, who gets protection. Cancer also holds memory, especially emotional memory. It's also a pretty strong symbol for the place that you go to raise a family, which Cancer also embodies. So this is a city whose core identity is deeply tied to land and belonging, and this alone tells us something very important, that this place feels what happened here. It absorbed it. So when you look at the top of the chart in public life, you see the sign of Gemini right here at the very top. It's in a placement known as the midheaven. Gemini is communication, it's the media, it's conversation, it's argument, it's narrative. This is a city where what happens locally becomes a national conversation over and over again. The part of the chart I keep coming back to is right at the ascendant over here. So we also can't overlook that. And for those of you who are astrologists in the room, I am not going to focus on aspects today. We are just focusing on some of the major planetary placement and what those themes represent. If there's enough interest in this, I can come back and we can explore some of the planetary relationships and really dive deep. The ascendant describes how a place operates in the world on a day-to-day level. It's the face that it presents, the way it organizes itself, the way it tries to manage reality. And Virgo is definitely not a flashy energy. Virgo is a really hardy earth sign. Virgo is administrative, it's procedural, it's managerial, it's about systems, rules, efficiency, classification. Virgo wants things to function correctly. It wants order. It wants processes that make sense, and it wants to be able to say, this is how it works. So from the very beginning, this place was oriented around management of land, of people, of resources. Virgo energy doesn't usually see itself as violent or aggressive. It sees itself as practical, necessary, responsible, and it believes it's actually doing what needs to be done. And this is important because colonial power is entrenched in all of this. It presents itself first as order. So Virgo is the energy of paperwork, of surveys. It seems on the outside that it makes sense. Of ledgers, of treaties written in very, very careful language, of systems that are designed to appear neutral and even fair when the outcome is not. So when St. Anthony was founded, the imprint wasn't just about land being taken, it was about land being organized, categorized, defined, placed into a system that claims some sort of legitimacy through procedure rather than intentional consent and relationship. So Virgo rising tells us that the city's identity is deeply tied to the belief that systems can solve problems, that if the rules are followed, the process is justified. And that's the shadow side of Virgo. That's the shadow side. It is always right as long as it is legal, and there's regulation, and then moral administration is floated as a moral framework. When Virgo is disconnected from humility, from care, it becomes rigid. It can prioritize functions over humanity. It can reduce living beings to variables in a system. And it convinces itself that harm is acceptable as long as it happens by the book. By the book. That's part of the imprint. This is a city that has long relied on systems to manage tension rather than relationships to resolve it, systems to contain rather than to heal, and procedures that justify outcomes that were never consensual to begin with. So, Virgo rising seeks control through perceived order. And when that order is challenged, it often doubles down, refining rules, tightening the process, and increasing regulation. So there's one other area that I want to talk about that's really important. And because I am a chart astrologist, but I am also an evolutionary astrologist. Evolutionary astrology deals with the arc of the soul of people and also of places. And it can tell us a tremendous amount about about the energy of the soul of a place and what is its sort of like, for lack of a better word, its destiny. Where is its opportunity? Where is its growth curve? What is it growing into? And I got really excited about it when I started looking at the chart from that perspective. So the North Node is in Libra right here. This little funny looking sign is the North Node, and it's in the sign of Libra. And so the soul essence of this place actually governs justice, fairness, peacemaking, honoring treaties, consensual agreements. It wants balance. It reveals and teaches us what's best for all, not just for some. And right next to Libra, right next to this little north node, we have a little symbol here. And this is a point in the sky known as Chiron. And it represents the wounding of a place and a person. It also represents the opportunity. And so, how interesting, I don't find any of this coincidence, but how interesting that the soul of this place, the symbol that represents the soul of this place and the peacemaking, consensual honoring of agreements sits right next to also the wounding of this place in the exact same sign. So this is a very, very powerful relationship. And it's very, very consistent with a place founded through treaties that were broken. What we also know about Chiron is that, as I said, it resembles the direction of the healing. So land back, reparations are just a small part of that. The wound and the healing are interlinked. They inform one another, working together, finding cohesion, finding collaboration, finding the best direction for the whole. That's the healing imprint. That's the opportunity. And then when I think about colonial trauma, especially around land, the planet I pay the most attention to is Saturn. And Saturn lives right here in the sign of Pisces in the sixth house. Saturn governs law, boundaries, contracts, ownership, enforcement, and colonialism is Saturn taken to an extreme, and land becoming property instead of relationship. And Saturn is in the sign of Pisces, and Pisces is a little tricky. It's where accountability gets very blurry, where suffering is acknowledged emotionally, but not structurally. It is the perfect fodder for continued misunderstandings and very blurred lines. It struggles to hold structure where it's needed the most. So, where harm is remembered vaguely, it's easy to avoid dealing with it, and responsibility dissolves right along with it. So, astrologically, land and ancestry live in the fourth house in a person's chart, but in a place. It's the fourth house. But when land trauma isn't resolved, it migrates into the eighth house, the house of inherited trauma, collective grief, which is right here. This is the eighth house. Unresolved death and tremendous wounding and psychic residue. And that's when things can start repeating. And that's when moments feel bigger than the immediate circumstances, when people ask, why here? Why again? Because the land remembers, it inescapably seeps into the atmosphere around relational proximity to oppression and violence. It blurs lines between collective power and individual privilege, and Pluto plays a role here. So Pluto lives right here, and Pluto is the planet of power, domination, death, and forced transformation. So, in colonial contexts, Pluto is conquest, the moment force replaces consent. Pluto doesn't care how much time has passed, it will keep surfacing until the truth is acknowledged. So, let's talk a little bit about what shows up in the St. Anthony birth chart around the descendant. So, we talked about the ascendant. What we need to reckon with as well is the descendant. So, one of the most striking things, I would say the most striking thing about St. Anthony chart is the amount of Aries energy that hovers around the descendant. And this is representing the descendant, and I'll tell you what that means in just a second. It's the part of the chart that describes who we meet, who confronts us, and how power shows up in relationship. So here we have a city that is dealing with tremendous shadowy energy around power and abuses of power, death, destruction, and secrets. And then we also have this intense amount of Aries energy living around the descendant with very powerful planets, Mars and Uranus. And Aries is not a subtle energy. It is a fire sign. It's assertion, it's the warrior, it's force, it's urgency, it's action taken without consensus. It's we move first and then we deal with the consequences later. Aries does not wait to be invited. So when it gathers around the descendant like that, it tells a very important story about how this place experiences conflict and with the others. It says that external forces arrive here very hot, very fast, very confrontational. That authority shows up through action, through enforcement, not negotiation. This is a city meeting power face to face. So, yeah, this descendant is where we encounter the others. So, like I said, opponents, adversaries, declared, undeclared enemies, open conflict. Nothing is hidden with Aries. So, this energy does not stay internal, it plays out publicly, relationally, and visibly. So that matters because when a place is founded through this kind of a level of assertion rather than through consent and relationship, and it's force backed by law from the ascendant Virgo, that pattern, it doesn't disappear. It shows up again and again in the form of confrontations between authority and community. It's heavy. It's heavy. So when people ask why Minneapolis becomes this flashpoint, why things erupt here instead of quietly sort of dissolving, this is part of the answer. This is a city whose chart is wired for direct confrontation with power. Things do not stay underground, they come to the surface. And when you place that Aries energy next to historical reality of stolen land and broken agreements, you start to see how volatile that combination really is. So that brings us to now. The current federal agent present in Minneapolis, the sense of, yes, the occupation, the enforcement, the terror, the outside authority entering neighborhoods. This is a textbook expression of the patterns I'm speaking about. This is Aries on the descendant again and again. External force, federal authority, action without consent, presence without invitation, law backed by threat, and a city that responds by meeting it head on. So when Aries energy isn't met with accountability or reflection, it keeps repeating at a higher volume. And so the chart tells us that Minneapolis is not a place where that kind of energy goes unnoticed or unchallenged, and it meets the destiny, the soul destiny of Minneapolis, which is the North Node in Libra, which is that beautiful peacemaking energy. And so now what you're seeing people coming out of the woodwork that may have not participated until now, which is a shame, but it is what it is. And now we can feel that sense of need to care for the other and the horror at people's homes being broken into and families being ripped apart. This sun in Cancer energy of the traditional values that are upheld here, family, of our clan, of this sense of something being betrayed. This is coming through that North Node in Libra as we are beginning to claim, really claiming our destiny as a soul of a city and rectifying the wound that is raw and open right now. We are meeting a moment with clarity, and more of us are seeing the wound and responding now. The big question will always be why now and why not sooner? It is a very complex one. I'm going to attempt to deliver a gentle and cohesive reply to that in part 3 when we look at some of the transits of St. Anthony, which reflect the current moment in time. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think. And I look forward to more discussion and conversation with you all. Take care.